Well, hello everyone, and welcome to our next lecture. Today we are going to be discussing the properties of sound and digital audio. I have found through my experiences, both as an instructor and a student, and I guess also as a creative, that having a really firm understanding of how sound and digital audio works at the more fundamental levels is tremendously important. When we interact with software and tools and hardware that helps us generate music and audio, a lot of the terminology that connects to these underlying properties of sound and digital audio, it comes up, and it's really important to have a firm understanding of how these things work. So we're going to spend a bit of time today discussing these properties of sound and digital audio. Then we'll dive into the software side of things and see how these terms apply and why they are so important for us. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and dive right in. So the agenda for the day is to discuss what sound is. We will also discuss amplitude, frequency, and envelopes. Moving slightly more to the digital audio side of things, we will discuss sample rate, bit depth, and quantization, and we will also finish our discussion with a little bit of talk on sound files and some common sound file types that you might need to be aware of. So what is sound? That's a great question. We're all hopefully trying to do work with sound and music, so we should have a pretty good idea of what it is. I've been shocked at how many professional musicians in my life I've been able to ask, well, what is sound? And how few of them are able to actually give a really good definition of it. And I think it's something that we should be aware of and be able to talk about with some degree of authority. So vibrations of air pressure, that's kind of a really big, broad definition of what sound is. We live in this pressurized system, right? The planet Earth has an atmosphere, and as a result, there is pressure with our air. Anytime we have a vibration of that air pressure, we as human beings perceive that as sound. Our eardrums respond to very subtle changes of pressure within the atmosphere. Oscillating compressions, as we say here, greater pressure and less pressure, or compression and rarefaction. So if you're not used to the word rarefaction, it's really the opposite of compression. Compression means to smush things together. Rarefaction means to go back outward. That's really what sound is. It's this concept of molecules in the air compressing and then moving back outward. So for example, if I clap my hands, I'll just do a single clap. What lets us hear that as sound is that the air molecules near my hands smushed together when I smashed my hands together, and then they very quickly rarefact back outward, and that's what lets us get that wave through the air that we perceive as sound. If we do a continuous tone, like a violin playing a sound or a synthesizer holding a sustained pitch, rather than just a single compression and rarefaction, it's constant. The sound is smushing together and moving back out. Smush, expand, smush, expand. That's really what sound at the end of the day is. It's these air molecules that are all around us, smushing together and moving back outward. When the air pressures move, our eardrums move accordingly. When the air pushes forward, our eardrum goes back. It pushes into our head just a little bit, which tells the bones in our inner ear or the bones in our middle ear to respond. That goes to the cochlea, and our brain translates that into sound. An important thing that I think is worth remembering is that the molecules in the air, when we make sound, the molecules themselves don't travel from the source of the sound to the listener. They mostly stay where they are. They just vibrate back and forth sort of in place. A good example would be something like a ball pit at like some kind of like McDonald's play place or something like that, or maybe a Chuck E. Cheese. You could have that ball pit, and you could sort of go to the side of that ball pit and push against it. There's going to be a ripple effect that potentially goes all the way through that ball pit, depending on how much force you exert upon the side of that structure. Each individual ball within that ball pit is not moving the length of the ball pit. They're just bumping the one next to it and causing that force to ripple more and more throughout that structure. It's the very same thing with sound. We don't move all the molecules from point A to point B. We just push them, and they push the molecule next to them and so forth. This means that sound needs a medium to travel through. We as human beings primarily hear sound through the air, but we can also hear it underwater. It just sounds a little different because we're not accustomed to that. But sound cannot travel if there is no medium. That's why there is no sound in space outside of an atmosphere. So any science fiction film that has like explosions and sounds of lasers and all that in space, that's not really accurate. A few other films have done that really cool and exciting ways. If you've seen Gravity, you know what I'm talking about. So let's keep going. A graphical representation of sound can be tremendously useful for us. We can picture time on the x-axis, and we can picture amplitude on the y-axis. We'll discuss in detail what exactly we mean by amplitude, But this graphical representation of sound can help us imagine the idea of compression and rarefaction over time. So these peaks above the center line correlate to compression. So every time the air compresses, we see this upward peak. And every time we see one of these troughs where we go below the center line, it's correlating to rarefaction. That's where the molecules are going back to where they are. The center line would equal no changes in air pressure. That doesn't mean there's no air pressure. If there was, we would all die. Rather, it just means that it is the static amount of air pressure that we are experiencing at any given moment. Then we have a sound, and a sound will cause the air to compress as it does in the upward peak, and then expand or rarefact in the downward peaks. This happens over some amount of time, and we could view it as such. Frequency is a very fundamental component of sound, and what it's really discussing is the rate that the air pressure expands and contracts. So the faster that the air is compressing and expanding, right, squishing and then returning back to where it was, squishing and expanding, the faster that that happens, the more quickly the rate of change of air pressure, that's what's going to determine the frequency of the sound. Frequency is perceived as higher or lower pitches. We can think about low notes versus high notes on an instrument. So on a piano, a note such as that has a higher frequency than a note such as this. That means that this note is oscillating in the air more quickly than this note, right? The rate of change of air pressure is quicker on a higher note. It has a higher frequency than this lower note. So the greater the rate of change of this air pressure contraction and expansion is what we call frequency. So as mentioned, a slower rate of oscillations equals low frequency / low notes. A faster rate of oscillations equals high frequencies or high notes. A little bit more on frequency. We measure frequency in cycles per second, or hertz. So however many times per second the air compresses and then expands, how many times it does that per second, that's what we measure frequency in, and we call that hertz. 10,000 hertz would also be referred to as 10 kilohertz. 20,000 hertz would be referred to as 20 kilohertz. So we will sometimes say hertz, sometimes we will say kilohertz. Humans can hear a range approximately from 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz. That being said, very few people can actually hear that full range, but that's sort of our textbook definition. Typically, if you're younger and you have a good ear, you might actually be able to hear that full range. As you get older, we tend to lose our higher frequency range of hearing. It's called presbycusis. It happens to all of us, regardless of what we have done to our ears. If you've been particularly hard on your ears earlier in your life, you might have more loss of higher frequency content when you're still relatively young. But that's generally what we call the textbook range of what we can hear. 20 hertz, which is quite low, all the way to 20,000 hertz, or we could say 20 kilohertz, which is quite high. So this graphical representation of frequency is certainly great in theory, and for me it helps represent what sound would look like. In real time, these frequencies are often difficult to visualize because the rate of oscillation is actually so fast. I mean, if we have a sound that is rapidly compressing and expanding 5,000 times per second, a graphical representation might not serve us super well. We'd have to zoom in tremendously far to actually see that sort of wave of compression and expansion. So this is useful in theory. It's not always incredibly possible in practicality. So the wave that I'm showing here would actually be about 4 hertz. And you can tell I start at this bottom point, this trough, and I eventually end back on that upward peak. And we get through that full wave 4 times. And if we said that this graphical representation of time on the x-axis was 1 second, that would mean we are getting 4 vibrations per second. This would be a tone that we could not perceive because it would be too low for our brain to make sense of. A little bit more on frequency. A sine tone looks as such, and you might be familiar with the concept of a sine wave from mathematics. It's a perfectly periodic cycle, and it's going to produce a single frequency. This would be what we call a sine tone. A sine tone is not a complex tone and has no harmonics or overtones. I will discuss in a second what harmonics and overtones really are and how they influence sound, but really what this means is that sine tones are incredibly pure. Let's go ahead and listen to some examples of some sine tones. So a wonderful tool for this is what we call onlinetonegenerator.com. It lets us generate different waveforms. We will start with the sine tone. We will discuss these other waveforms in the not too distant future. It lets us choose a frequency in hertz, and then we can play that tone. I'm going to turn it down just a little bit. I'm going to make sure that we can hear it on this recording. Let's go ahead and play 440 hertz as a sine tone. Now, you may be able to perceive how that is really just a singular tone. It's a very simple tone with no higher frequency content above it. Just to give you an example of something that would contrast that, let's do a sawtooth wave at 440 hertz. You might notice how that tone seems richer and seems as though it has more harmonic and frequency content to it. That's because it does. And as we will discuss in the future, just about any sound you want to create can in fact be created by combining the right combination of sine tones, such as this sawtooth wave, which is really just a bunch of sine tones on top of each other. Sounds in the real world consist of many frequencies occurring simultaneously, so rarely do sine tones occur in nature is another good way to think about this. We have to generate sine tones artificially with synthesizers or computers. Most of the sounds we hear are the result of many vibrations summing to a single force against our eardrums. Remember, all sounds, no matter how complex, do nothing more than push your eardrum back and forth by a very, very small amount. We have two eardrums, but if it helps for the sake of this visualization, just imagine having one eardrum. Every sound, no matter how complex, whether it's a choir of 100 people singing together, or a symphony orchestra of 80 people, or a busy street in a large city, all of those waves, all of those individual sounds sum together in the air before they get to your ear. And all they do is push your eardrum back and forth by the tiniest little amount. And it's pretty amazing that our brain is able to take that rapid oscillation of pressure against our eardrum and turn it into all the things that we are capable of understanding. The human ear is quite remarkable, but the auditory nerve and the locations of the brain that process and make meaning from that audio are even more incredible. So I just often remember that. I think no matter how complex the sound is, it's just our eardrum going back and forth by the tiniest little wiggles. Our brain takes the stream of vibrations and sorts the rest out, and it's amazing, which is basically what I was just saying. We need to talk about frequency and perception and how we as human beings perceive frequency when it enters our brain. So humans do not perceive changes in frequency in a linear fashion. This is a very, very important concept to remember. So as the example above shows, moving from 20 Hz to 40 Hz will sound like a greater distance between pitches than moving from 40 to 20, even though both of these instances are moving by just 20 Hz. So going from 20 Hz to 40 Hz, okay, that will sound like some amount of distance between two different pitches. You'll notice it is a difference of 20 Hz. The difference between 40 and 60 Hz is also a difference of 20 Hz. However, we will not hear those distances as equal to each other. Rather, the equation here would be an accurate representation of how we perceive frequency. Doubling a frequency always yields the same perceptual difference. In this case, we would call that an octave, which is a term we borrow from the common musical vernacular. When we double a frequency, we are going up one octave. But the idea of moving from 20 Hz to 40 Hz is only a difference of 20 Hz. Moving from 500 Hz to 1000 Hz, that is a difference of 500 Hz. Yet we are going to perceive those distances as equal. So it depends on where we are in the frequency spectrum. So when in doubt, remember that doubling of a frequency will result in the same perceptual difference between that frequency and another. Let us then turn our attention to amplitude. Amplitude and frequency are two sides of the same coin. And our amplitude time domain representation, the same graphic we saw before, shows amplitude at the center line. So I mentioned this before. If we are at that center line, we are essentially saying there are no changes in air pressure. As a result, there are no sounds, and therefore there are no amplitudes to measure. When we are working in this time domain with this graph that we have already been looking at, we can think of amplitude as going from a range of -1 to 1. And amplitude, more or less, is what we perceive as changes in loudness. The greater the amplitude, the louder the sound. So in other words, the greater the displacement from that center line, the higher the peak and the lower the trough, the higher the amplitude, the louder the sound is going to be. There are a few caveats to that, which we will discuss in the future, but more often than not, if you see a wave that is moving either higher or lower from that center line compared to another, it's going to be louder. We can measure this theoretically from -1 to 1. We will see in the digital world this makes perfect sense. Theoretically, the loudest sound on Earth reaching -1 would mean we have to have a sound that compresses so much and then rarefacts so much that we actually end up having a vacuum where there is no air. So that would be our sort of theoretical limit of this 1 to -1. It would be determined by the actual atmosphere. As we will see in the world of digital audio, this becomes a little easier to keep track of. We need to talk about perception with amplitude as well. So like frequency, amplitude is not perceived as changing equally when there are equal changes in air pressure. So this is very, very similar to what we were just discussing with frequency. The perceived difference between 0.25 and 0.5 is greater in comparison to the perceived difference between 0.5 and 0.75. So once again, we are moving by a distance of 0.25, but we are saying that that distance of 0.25 is not always equal depending on where we are relative to that center line of zero displacement. Similar to frequency, greater amplitudes require greater change in order to be perceived as the same difference. So unlike frequency though, the manner in which we commonly measure amplitude takes this nonlinear manner in which we hear amplitude and it corrects it, which is great. So when we're discussing frequency and we are discussing hertz, the measurement and label of hertz is unfortunately a linear measurement. So we have to keep in mind the fact that we don't perceive frequency linearly. When we are talking about amplitude, we use dB or decibels, which is a term you might be familiar with for helping to measure amplitude and loudness. The decibel system takes into account this non-linear perception of sound. So when we say going from 20 to 30 decibels is a difference of 10 decibels, that does equal a difference of 30 to 40. Both of those are movements of 10 decibels, and they are equal because that's what the decibel scale is all about. It's about having a non-linear system for measuring something, in this case, amplitude. So once again, showing that the decibel going from 20 to 30 is equal of going from 30 to 40. And we can say that decibels are the most common measurement for amplitude. Decibels specifically measure SPL, or sound pressure level. And in fact, some of you may have interacted with an SPL meter before, or a sound pressure level meter. It's a little device that you can hold up in the air and it will measure the sound pressure level, how much the sound, it will measure how much the air is being displaced, and it will convert that to decibels for us. And as we can see here, an increase of 10 decibels results in a sound that will be perceived as approximately twice as loud. So if I'm playing an instrument at 20 dB and I go up 10 dB to 30 dB, it will sound twice as loud. We don't have to go from 20 all the way to 40. This is true across the whole amplitude spectrum. If I'm playing at 90 decibels and I go to 100, it will sound twice as loud. So you have to be mindful of the fact that a relatively small number of decibels is actually a really powerful increase in terms of the overall amplitude and loudness. So the graphical representations of sound that we have been looking at thus far could be referred to as a waveform. They show us the displacement of air over time. All sounds can in fact be viewed and expressed as this waveform, such as the one shown on the left. Any sound that is made can be expressed this way because, again, remember, that's ultimately all that sound is. It's just changes in air pressure. The waveform showing here is a complete representation of that sound, but it doesn't give us everything that we necessarily want to know about sound. And that's because sound results from multiple frequencies at different amplitudes and change in amplitude and/or frequency at rapid rates. So we do not clearly see the frequencies present in real sounds in the amplitude time representations, such as the ones we've been looking at thus far. In other words, this example on the left, if you're looking at this, can you tell me what frequencies are present? Can you go, oh yeah, there's middle C, and oh, there's A4, and oh, there's a low D2? Not really. In fact, no one can do that. If you can, email me. I'd be really fascinated to find out. As a result of this issue, we need another graphical representation of sound to clearly view frequency content, and luckily we have one. The spectrum of a sound, which is defined as the relative amplitudes of all the frequency components present in a sound at any given time, requires a different graphical representation. The spectrum of a sound is essentially its recipe. It gives all the ingredients compared to this time domain representation, which really lets us only see amplitude changes. This spectrum is going to tell us everything we want to know about the sound. It's going to tell us the frequency of various components, the amplitude of each of those frequencies, and it can also tell us the phase of each of these frequencies. When we combine all these things into this graphic representation as we see here, we are now able to get a much more detailed picture of what is actually happening in this sound. The spectrum showing on the left, if we pay attention to what's going on here, we can realize how much more information we are able to gain. So we are still plotting amplitude on the y-axis, but rather than showing time on the x-axis, we are now showing frequency. So we can see at the bottom here the approximate range of human hearing. Notice the 20 in the lower left-hand corner for 20 Hz, ranging all the way up to 10K. It's missing the label for 20K, but we can see that there is an approximate gap that would get us all the way to 20,000 Hz. We can then see the relative amplitude of each frequency. So for example, you can notice that at about 390 Hertz, there's a massive dip, which means this sound has no frequency content at around 390. We can also see that at maybe around 550, we have a pretty large spike. We can also see another large spike somewhere around little over 900, somewhere in that range. We can see which frequencies have particularly large amplitudes. This is great for complex sounds. If we were looking at the spectrum of a sine tone, as we listened to earlier, we would see a single spike for just that frequency. This image that we are currently looking at is far more representative of what a typical sound will look like, a broad range of frequencies, each at different amplitudes. So for example, if we were to have two different instruments play the same pitch, how can we tell which instrument is which? You have a clarinet and you have an oboe, and they're both playing A4. They're playing that note. How do you know which one's which? They're both vibrating at 440 Hertz. How on earth can we tell these things apart? It's important to note that they will share the same fundamental frequency only, in other words, that lowest note of their spectrum. Their spectrums will each be unique, and each will have different overtones / partials at different frequencies, amplitudes, and phases. So here's an example of a D-sharp 3 being played on a bass clarinet and a D-sharp 3 being played on a trombone. Notice the large spike in amplitude that they have furthest to the left. That would be that fundamental frequency. That would be that D-sharp 3 that we are talking about, that low note that they are both playing, that if we were asked to hum that pitch back, that is the pitch that we would hum. But notice how different their spectra are compared to each other. Each has different frequencies and at different amounts above that fundamental frequency. And those two different spectra are what let us hear these tones as being quite different from one another. This is really getting into the idea of timbre. These instruments have two different timbres because their spectra is different. And the reason that the spectrum from one instrument to another is different is based off the physical design of that instrument. Which frequencies resonate inside the bass clarinet versus the D-sharp trombone? Which ones escape, which ones lose energy, which ones are reinforced with energy, which ones are brought to greater energy based off where the instrument is playing and who is playing it. All of these things affect timbre and give us a different spectrum from one sound to another. This is something that comes in really handy when we are trying to synthesize original sounds. We want to have different sounds with very different spectra as we create them. Another really fundamental component of audio is what we call the envelope. We have a graphic representation on the left which looks very similar to our graphic representation of amplitude over time. It's just a little bit different. We can say that all sounds begin at silence and reach a certain maximum amplitude, and then they eventually stop. No sound really just continues infinitely. So again, this is important. All sounds begin at silence. So just imagine I am sitting at a piano, and until I play a key, there is no sound. And then I play a key, I press the key down as is shown on our chart on the left, and we eventually reach that sort of peak amplitude of that tone. It must happen over some amount of time. All sounds don't just go from silent to noisy instantaneously. Just like all things in this universe, it must happen over some amount of time. Some sounds very quickly reach this maximum amplitude, like a cymbal crash or hitting a drum. If you hit a snare drum, it seems like it's almost instantaneous, but that still happens over maybe just a fraction of a millisecond. Maybe if it's something like the human voice or a violin, those sounds take a little bit longer to sort of reach that maximum amplitude. We eventually can say that there are the attack, decay, sustain, and release portions of an envelope. We will return to this envelope shape in the very near future when looking at how a synthesizer works, because if we're going to synthesize a tone, it is going to require an envelope. This example on the left, which says key down and key up, we could think of that as a synthesizer. We press the key down and the synthesizer goes from quiet to some maximum amount of amplitude. We can program in a decay time so it doesn't stay at that maximum amplitude. As long as we are holding the key down, it will sustain, and eventually we lift our finger up off the key and the sound releases over some amount of time. So in other words, the shape of this journey over time is a sound's envelope, and it greatly affects the sound's quality. Spectrum plus envelope equals highly accurate means of describing sound. If we know the spectrum and we know the envelope, we now have all the tools we need to label a sound with great detail. We will also want to have these things in mind when we create sounds, which will be something we do in the very near future. So let's talk a little bit about analog sound then. So a microphone transduces or converts energy, in this case acoustical pressure, these waves in the air, and it converts it to electrical energy, oscillations in voltage. So just as a reminder, microphones are a form of transducer. We have lots of transducers that we work with in real life. Light bulbs are transducers. The human body is a transducer. Speakers, or like audio monitors, are really the transducers that are the exact flip side of this. They take oscillations in voltage and turn it back into acoustical pressure or mechanical energy because there are physical objects moving, in this case molecules. So these oscillations in electrical energy can be graphed in the same exact manner as acoustical energy. So we can think about this time domain relationship where we are thinking about how we have the center line and above it is compression and below it is rarefaction. Well, now we can think about that as just positive and negative current within an electrical system. To store sound in an analog format, magnetic particles are displaced on tape by an incoming waveform in a theoretically continuous manner. So if you know a little bit about how tape works, and if you've listened to music recorded on tape, even though it's not used nearly as often as it used to be, we're thinking about how that tape is magnetic and it's moving up against another surface. And all it does is cause that surface to move up and down, the playhead within a tape system. The magnetic tape causes that playhead to vibrate up and down really quickly by really subtle amounts, which we can then turn back into changes of sound in the air. We can also think of the grooves in a record as being analogous to the compressions and rarefactions of air. So if you ever get a chance, look at close-up images of a record, and you'll notice that these are just grooves being carved either more deeply or less deeply over time. We can have shallow grooves, we can have deep grooves. Those grooves in the record that go up and down and wobble back and forth are analogous to how your eardrum presses back and forth, or analogous to how a speaker cone presses back and forth. Again, we can reduce just about all sounds, well, really all sounds, we can reduce to just things being pushed back and forth. So whether that's a magnetic piece of tape that causes a playhead to move up and down, or grooves on a record that causes a needle to move up and down, and then we send that electric energy to a speaker cone, which causes the speaker cone to push back and forth, which causes the air molecules in the air to push back and forth, which eventually hit your eardrum, and your eardrum pushes back and forth. It's amazing how complex sound is and how complex these systems are for recreating it, but how simple at the end of the day it is. It's just wiggling back and forth, little wiggles back and forth. People often ask me, what is music? And I say it's wiggly air. That's all music is. So graphic representations. We can return to this same model we've seen before, but now we can think about how this is talking about analog audio rather than just sound in the air. The same graphic representations apply. However, rather than representing the changes in air pressure, this graph on the left now represents changes in voltage. So we have positive and negative current in a wire that's causing a speaker cone to push back and forth. You sing into a microphone, you cause a membrane in that microphone to wiggle back and forth, and then we convert that into voltage. Keep in mind, these changes in voltage are analogous to changes in air pressure, so they don't directly represent changes in air pressure, but they kind of do. So this graph on the left could easily be a graphic representation of sound in the air or voltage in an analog system. And ideally, if it's captured in high quality, that voltage will be analogous to the changes in the air, which is why we call it analog audio, because it is analogous to the original changes in air pressure. We simply convert that to voltage, and then we potentially store that on something like magnetic tape, or a record, or a wax cylinder if we go far enough back. All of these systems just cause something to wiggle back and forth, again, whether it's a needle or a playhead. Returning to the idea of a spectrum, we won't measure amplitude once we've converted it to analog audio at 0 dB. So 0 decibels in the real world is approximately the quietest sound a human being can hear. It's a rather arbitrary level, but 0 decibels is just about the quietest thing that we can hear, and then we measure upward. Once we get to 90 decibels, things get loud. Once we get over 100, things start to get really loud, and we can eventually reach pain once we get to about 110 and so forth. And we can really damage our hearing if we get much higher than that. So instead, when we are in this analog audio system, we're going to measure sound starting at negative infinity, and we will work upward, reaching to 0, instead of 0 being at the bottom. So we're sort of just flipping this scale, but I think once we get into the software side of things, you will see why this makes even more sense. And you can see in our graphic representation of this spectrum on the left, on the y-axis, we are still measuring amplitude, but we are now measuring it in decibels, where the lower left-hand corner represents negative infinity, and we can reach upward towards 0. We call this dbfs, or decibels relative to full scale. So in most analog, and as we will see, digital systems of audio, when we are talking about decibels, we're not talking about decibels in the physical world that start at 0 and go upward. We are talking about decibels relative to full scale, which start at negative infinity and work their way up to 0. The amount of difference between 3 and 6 decibels and 3 and 6 decibels relative to full scale is the same. The unit of measurement remains the same, but the scale in which we are putting it changes to become more useful within these systems. So in this case, full scale is equal to 0. 0 is equal to the greatest amount of amplitude displacement possible within the current system. So negative infinity would be the quietest possible sound, or no sound, or really just the noise floor of the system. And as we work up to 0, we reach the loudest possible sound within this system, or the greatest possible amount of amplitude. For example, a record groove that is pressed all the way through the vinyl. So if you think about how a record is printed, we carve grooves into that vinyl, but the record is only so thick. And if we carve all the way through that record, or all the way to its base, we've reached that 0 point. We've reached the theoretical greatest amount of displacement inherent in that system. Digital audio. This is where it starts to become what we are dealing with in this course, but as I mentioned before, all the terms from before are still going to apply, and we're going to see them in our software. So after we transduce acoustic energy to electric energy, we can convert the analog signal to a digital format. Once we are in that digital format, it becomes super easy to store, reproduce, combine, and manipulate digital audio signals. The same graphs still apply, and we measure amplitude from negative infinity to 0 dB. So everything I was just talking about with that analog system is very, very similar, but rather than having our audio stored in a physical medium, like a record or a piece of tape, it's stored as digital information on a disk. So we want to talk about digital audio and the concept of sample rate, and I want to offer an analogy that I think is useful. Just imagine watching a movie, any movie, TV show, or even a video game, some kind of visual image that is moving. This moving image, this film, this movie, it's nothing more than a series of individual images being played back at a quick rate. You probably know that film is nothing more than a series of individual images. It's like a flip book, right? For example, the American cinema presents 24 individual images or frames per second, and that will look like a real moving image to us. Our brain interprets these individual images as a moving image. So if we have enough images presented to our eye quickly enough, we will see it as a real moving object. We will see things in motion. We need about 15 frames per second. So then in the world of digital audio, the sample rate is very similar. This whole idea is also true with audio. But instead of individual pictures, we capture individual instances of amplitude and we call them samples. So we're not using a camera to capture light in a little square frame called a picture. Instead, we're using microphones to capture instantaneous moments of amplitude displacement. How much has the air pressure been displaced in that instance, and that is what we call a sample. If we capture enough samples and play them back rapidly, we can recreate a sound. So it's just the same as images. We capture enough images and play them back, we see a moving image. We capture enough samples and play them back, we're going to recreate audio. Now, it takes about 15 images per second for our eye to see a series of pictures as a moving image. You need a minimum of 15 images per second for us to see that and for our brain to be convinced that what we are seeing is not a series of individual images, but a moving image. With audio, we need over 40,000 samples per second to accurately recreate most sound, which is pretty fascinating that we need to capture sound that rapidly. A little bit more on sampling rate. The speed at which we capture or play back these samples, well, that's what we call the sample rate. That is the rate of those samples, how many per second. We usually measure it in a value of kilohertz. We could say hertz, but we are usually doing it so frequently that we want to say kilohertz. Common sample rates include 44,100, 48, 96, and 192 kilohertz. So 44.1 kilohertz or 48 kilohertz or 96 kilohertz, that would mean 44,100 samples per second or 48,000 samples per second or 96,000 samples per second, all the way up to 192,000 samples per second, though that is extremely high quality. The higher the sample rate, the larger your digital file size. This makes sense. If we are using digital files and if we have more bits of information that we're holding on to, well, the file size will increase. So we rarely listen to audio files at 192 kilohertz, but it is possible. The sampling rate determines the highest frequency a digital audio system can correctly represent. That's why we care about having a certain minimum sample rate, because if we go below a certain threshold of that sample rate, we are no longer going to accurately be able to represent certain sounds, and particularly certain sounds that fall within the range of our human hearing. The highest frequency that can be accurately represented is the sampling rate divided by 2. This frequency is something that we call the Nyquist frequency, which is named after a scientist with the last name Nyquist who came up with this. Since the higher range of hearing is about 20 kilohertz, we use a sampling rate of about 44.1 kilohertz. You'll notice that 44.1 is just over double 20. So this Nyquist frequency is being held true. This means that if we want to sample something, sample a tone that is 20 kilohertz, the upper range of our human hearing, we need a minimum of 40 kilohertz to do so. We happen to have settled on 44.1, and that gives us a little bit of headroom above that, and that's a very common sample rate that lets us relatively accurately capture the entire range of human hearing. Because, as mentioned, 44.1 divided by 2 is 22,050, just over that 20,000 range that we can approximately hear. If 44.1 kilohertz is sufficient, why are there higher sampling rates? I just mentioned in the last slide that there are higher sampling rates than 44.1. Spatial location becomes something that is easier to ascertain when we are listening to higher sample rates. We can localize where sounds are within something like a stereophonic field. And additionally, we just get more detail. I mean, it makes sense that if we capture more bits of audio along the way and play them back, we're going to get a higher quality example. Eventually, this has diminished returns and we will run out of detail that we can capture, but to a certain point, we can get higher quality audio. Now remember, the sampling rate determines the highest frequency that can be accurately represented. So if we do not have a high enough sampling rate, we are not going to accurately be able to recreate certain sounds. It's also important to recognize that each of these samples is a discrete value. This system is not continuous. Each sample that we capture is just an arbitrary number. Each one of those things by itself is meaningless. It's how they are all connected that becomes important. But remember that each is discrete. The other fundamental concept of digital audio is bit depth. So sample rate is huge. That takes into account frequency. If we don't have enough samples, we can't accurately recreate certain frequencies. The other side of the coin is bit depth. Every individual sample that we capture must, by its very nature, exist within a range of values. This should make sense. We are capturing audio in, and every 44,100th of a second, we are measuring the amplitude of that sound. We cannot measure between 0 and infinity. There has to be some range, because if our computer that we are converting this audio to digital files had a range of 0 to infinity, each little bit of audio would just be massive. It would be too huge. Our file size would become infinite instantaneously. So how many values does a light switch have? This is an example I often talk about. A light switch, not a dimmer switch, not a fancy dimmer switch, just a typical light switch when you walk into a room. How many values does it have? It can be on or off, right? It has 2 values. That would be an example of 1 bit. It is either on or it is off. Now, could you imagine if digital audio only had 1 bit? Imagine if we were capturing amplitude and it was either we are capturing it or we're not. It's all or nothing. Imagine playing that back. The speaker cone would either be doing everything or nothing. That's going to be severely limiting in capturing sounds. It would be chaos. The range of values that we can capture is what we call the bit depth. The higher the bit depth, the greater the range between the quietest and loudest sound possible. Note, and this is tremendously important, I see this issue frequently, just because you have a higher bit depth does not mean you have louder recordings or louder sounds. The theoretical maximum loudness is not determined by bit depth. The bit depth only determines the range of your amplitude. Again, think of the light bulb. If we had 1 bit audio, it would be on or off. Doesn't mean that the light bulb being on gets any brighter just because you add a dimmer switch, right? Same thing with audio. Just because we add steps in between 1 and 0 doesn't mean things get louder. It just increases our range. This is called the dynamic range between the quietest sound and the loudest sound. Common bit depths are 16, 24, and 32. So a 16-bit integer is 2 to the 16th power, which gives us a value of 65,536. A 24-bit value would be 2 to the 24th, which gives us 16 million. And that means that a 16-bit audio recording has 65,536 possible amplitudes. It would also mean that a 24-bit recording has over 16 million. So you can see that going from a 16-bit audio recording to a 24-bit audio recording has a tremendously different dynamic range. It might not seem like it, 16 to 24. It seems like a relatively small increase, but 2 to the 16th versus 2 to the 24th is a massive difference. If you are listening to an audio recording that is 16-bit, that means from the quietest sound up to the loudest sound, there are 65,536 possible amplitudes that we are capturing. Each sample has to fall within a range of 0 to 65,535 if we are counting 0, but that's how many discrete options there are. Let's talk a little bit about some errors that occur within the world of digital audio, because it's a wonderful system, but it is not perfect. And the first one that we want to discuss is clipping, because this is quite common, especially when people are starting to work with digital audio for the first time. This occurs when the incoming signal exceeds the maximum amplitude that can be represented by the digital audio system. So the image on the right, you can see that there are a few different locations marked in red where we are exceeding that bit depth, right? The sound is louder than the range which we predefined. So we have exceeded, in this case, if it was a 16-bit audio, we've exceeded that range of approximately 65,000 options. Our sound is louder than we intended. This causes audio artifacts that are generally not desired. It's a form of distortion, although we can use this artistically to great effect, and that's often very, very artistically exciting and interesting to do, but it's rarely something we want to do when we are capturing audio or converting something to digital, because that means we're really missing information, because that audio would be smooth. Instead, it becomes a flat line at the negative and positive poles of the digital audio representation. We are losing information. Rather than seeing how that audio curves like we want it to, it just becomes flat and truncated. So we've exceeded that bit depth option, and as a result, we are going to lose audio quality. This is analogous to overexposing film, where the amount of light captured on the medium exceeds its potential. So if you've ever worked with a camera and you open your aperture too far, or you increase the gain on your camera too high, and suddenly something that is not the color white becomes this like bright, blinding white spot, and we lose visual information. It's the exact same thing in the world of digital audio. We've exceeded our range and we lose information. Another common error in the world of digital audio is what we call aliasing, and this occurs when the incoming signal contains frequencies that exceed the Nyquist frequency. So here's an example of this concept we discussed a second ago in practicality. High frequencies require a faster sampling rate. If the frequency is too high, it will be digitally reproduced as a lower frequency. So we can see here that we have in this image on the right, our analog input is this very fast wave. And if the sample time cannot meet how quick that wave is going, our digital system is going to do its best to interpolate. And as a result, we get this digital output on the bottom, which no longer accurately represents that wave. So frequencies that go above 20,000, we're always going to have a difficult time capturing those if our sample rate isn't high enough. The higher the sample rate, the more accurately we can represent these frequencies in a digital sense. A little bit more on this. Aliasing is avoided in digital audio systems via built-in anti-aliasing filters. So quite often these anti-aliasing filters are working behind the scenes even if we are not aware of them. The anti-aliasing filter eliminates frequencies above the Nyquist frequency before they are digitally represented. So as long as we remove these super high frequencies, we don't have to worry about the digital system falsely recreating them and messing up the sound of what we're going for. They can't mess things up if we simply get rid of them before they're converted to digital information. Now remember to associate sampling rate with frequency, and also aliasing should be associated with frequency. One other type of error in the world of digital audio is what we call quantization, and this occurs when a sample is shifted in amplitude from its initial position to a point that can be represented in the digital audio system. So on this example on the right, we could think of those 4 lines as being possible bits within our bit depth, right? So I was saying in a 16-bit audio file, we have about 65,000 options to record amplitude. Let's pretend that those 4 lines are 4 of those 65,000 options. Notice that sample that we are capturing lives in between them, right? It's an amplitude that doesn't perfectly conform to one of those 65,000 options. So as a result of falling in between these two values, it's going to quantize this incoming amplitude sample and line it up with one of those 65,000 options that is available. This is more apparent for quiet signals, and that's because the computer's representation of amplitude on a wavetable isn't using decibels. It's using -1 to 1, as we talked about before. Thus, the most audible differences in sound is going from silence to quieter values. The more sensitive area is given the same amount of bits as other areas, meaning it has to cover more of our audible range within the same amount of resources. So go back to some of those earlier slides I was talking about with this graphic representation of sound, and you'll recall the displacement from 0 to 0.1 and 0.1 to 0.2 are not the same thing, but we are sampling things in a way that doesn't necessarily take that into account, so this becomes more obvious for quiet signals. So in order to solve this problem, our computer is going to take that bit, that audio that we are capturing, that sample, and it's going to shift it to some point on that grid. One of the last things we'll talk about today are some common sound files. A digital audio sound file is a file stored in a digital format that represents a digital audio signal over time. There are 3 primary parameters that determine the quality of this sound file. One is the sampling rate, which could be 44.1, which is CD quality audio, has been for a long time and still is. 48 kilohertz, that's things like DVDs, Blu-ray, YouTube videos, really just almost all video files will use 48 kilohertz as their sampling rate. 96K, which is going to be significantly higher, quite often used for recording audio, so you capture at a higher quality, but you might end up reducing that quality once you send it out to the world. The other big component, the second component of the 3 is bit depth. So 16 bits, that is once again CD quality audio and has been for a long time and probably will remain that way, which is 2 to the 16th, which gives us a little over 65,000 values. 24 bits, which again gives us 16 million values, as well as a 32-bit system, which gives us significantly greater. As you can see, we have 4,294,000,000. 32-bit audio bit depth is not common for recordings. It's common for the process of capturing audio, but once we turn it into an audio file, you'll rarely find a 32-bit audio system. In fact, many computers actually cannot interpolate this 32-bit system accurately, as well as a lot of audio systems. And then the last thing will be the number of channels. So whether it's a mono file, which is just one channel, audio coming out of one speaker, stereo, which is by far the most common, where there are two channels, a left and right speaker, and different audio coming out of each, quadraphonic, which would be 4, 5.1, which is common in cinema, that's 6 audio channels, where 5 are traditional speakers and 1 is just for low frequencies or a subwoofer. These 3 things combine in digital audio files to tell us what quality it will be. CD quality audio will be 44,100 kilohertz at 16 bits with 2 channels. Standard file formats for audio that are uncompressed, meaning we are not doing digital compression to try to make these files smaller, would be the WAV or waveform audio file, the AIF or AIFF, which is the audio interchange file format. Compressed audio formats that are common are the FLAC or FLAC, which is free lossless audio codec, or sometimes called flawless lossless audio codec, but it's a compressed audio file that really loses no quality but manages to make the file smaller. The MP3 or MPEG-2 audio layer 3 MP3s are still tremendously common. And then the AAC, the Advanced Audio Coding, which is Apple's codec on their for Apple Music and the iTunes Store. Keep in mind, when I say compressed versus uncompressed, I'm not talking about dynamic compression, like you use a compressor on your bass drum to really make your snare stand out. We're going to talk about that in the future. This is data compression. This is taking that stream of digital audio and getting rid of information to make the file size smaller and decrease your overall quality. Not the same thing as dynamic range compression. That is a topic for a future day. So for next time, we're going to dive into signal flow, gain, frequency, response, and some ideas of metering. We will also talk about all of these concepts that we just discussed and these future ones within the confines of a digital audio workstation, so we see it within the software. Now, this is a tremendous amount of information in a relatively quick amount of time, so you may want to watch this video more than once. But keep in mind, I will be returning to each and every one of these concepts in a more practical demonstration within the software. So if all of this doesn't immediately make sense and click right away, please note that that is okay, because I will do my best to contextualize these ideas for you as we progress. If you do have any questions, please do not feel concerned about reaching out. I will do my best to get back to you right away.